Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. So today I am back to talk about Henry VIII, The Heart and the Crown by Alison Weir. The second book in what is going to be the Tudor Roses Trilogy, the first book which focused on his mother, Elizabeth of York, this second book looking at Henry VIII, and the third which is called Mary I, Queen of Sorrows, coming out in May 2024. As you may know if you've been watching my videos, I absolutely loved the Six Tudor Queens series by Alison Weir, looking predictably, as you'd expect, at each of the wives of Henry VIII. I then absolutely fell in love with Elizabeth of York, looking at his mother, fictionalised depiction of her life. So I was very excited when I saw that this depiction of Henry VIII was going to be coming out. Though I had a little bit of trepidation having a look at some of the reviews, I saw that they were quite mixed, but I still wanted to keep an open mind as this book came out into paperback. I'm finally digging into it now. This second instalment fictionalises the life of Henry VIII, predominantly referred to as Harry throughout this book, as that was his nickname with his friends and family. Going from the end of the last book, so the death of Elizabeth of York, his mother, in 1503, and continuing on to Henry's own death in 1547. And you do get every major life point that you would expect with this book. We see his strained relationship with his father, Henry VII, his accession in 1509, being lauded and praised as this Renaissance prince, the handsomest man in Christendom, Henry's determination to prove himself as a worthy, pious, educated, and powerful king, a force to be reckoned with in Europe, leading to tension and conflict with Scotland and France, trying to keep good relationships with other European countries, particularly Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, occasionally with France, but mainly that is a tense relationship, particularly because of England asserting its claim to possession of France, his religious convictions and struggles, as he's faced with both restriction from the papacy but also feeling uneasy around all of the religious reform that is filtering through to his court, particularly as a result of Martin Luther and his influence, and of course all of these issues being exacerbated by his, to put it mildly, turbulent love life and difficulties in siring his crucial precious male heir, which results famously in him going through eventually 6 wives. All of that, of course, had to be covered in this book. How could it not? And as always, Alison Weir is very thorough in her depiction of Henry VIII. You know that she's combed through a lot of these historical sources and is trying to be as faithful as possible while also having to make crucial choices in her depiction of Henry. And unlike a character like Elizabeth of York and like some of the 6 wives, we have a lot more definitive evidence for Henry. We have pieces written by his own hand, the timeline is pretty set up for him, and his personality is pretty clear, but at the same time Henry VIII is also a very hard person to pin down because he is so many conflicting things at once. This is a man who is insecure but also proud, intelligent but also easily swayed by those around him, both a conservative and a reformer, a person who can inspire terror as well as awe. He is incredibly charismatic but is also capable of incredible cruelty. And Weir has to contend with all of these contrasting personality traits that we have for Henry. She has to make a decision as to what she's ultimately going to do with him, and I feel like that must be a really hard task because you have to get the balance right. And I feel like it's no surprise that this is a lower rated book in her series out of her most recent publications, because I don't feel like you're ever going to be able to please everybody. There are going to be people who only ever see Henry as a tyrant. You know, every time there is a new TV adaptation of the Tudors which depicts Henry as being like this handsome young athletic prince, you'll always have people popping up and saying that's not right, because a lot of people's image of Henry is from the later stages of his life. For so many people, Henry VIII is always going to be this big broad man, too angry, a religious zealot who had these 6 wives, and basically that is all they will ever see of him. The charisma, the athleticism, the intelligence is just not going to factor in for so many people, but it has to be there in Alison Weir's book because otherwise it is just not accurate. Henry has to be somebody that you sympathise with, especially before his reign when he's dealing with his father. We have to want him to succeed, but at the same time, if she is too lenient with him, when it gets to the point where he is executing friends, executing wives, it's not going to ring true. And I will say Alison Weir's Henry just seemed to be both more confused at the same time as being more on top of his courtiers and what they are plotting than you would necessarily think Henry might be. For example, Henry's doubts about his marriage to Catherine of Aragon start right at the beginning of their marriage, basically from the time that he consummates his marriage, which for me didn't particularly ring true. In my mind, I feel like Henry had a lot of love for Catherine, and though they did have struggles with conceiving a child, I feel like there was actually a lot more love than is portrayed in this book, and that love ends up being chipped away at, and it's really horrible and tragic, especially for Catherine. Whereas in this, it kind of felt inevitable because he didn't feel like he loved her right from the beginning. Generally, I will say that Alison Weir's portrayals of each of these characters is pretty consistent with what she laid out in the Six Tudor Queens series. So if you're going straight from them to this book, it's not going to be too jarring. I'm always going to have a pretty good time reading anything from Henry VIII's court because I do think when it comes to my Tudor love, this time period is what I really enjoy the most. Whenever we hit onto any of the main plot points, whenever we hit onto any of the wives, I'm always going to get really excited. Though I will say in terms of pacing, in terms of really digging into the meat of these characters, I did have some of the same issues with with this book as I did with The Marriage Game, which is an older book from Alison Weir, a fictionalisation of Elizabeth I's reign, and particularly of her dealings on the marriage market. In that this book, similarly to The Marriage Game, felt quite episodic. It felt very much like this happened, then this happened, then this happened, in comparison to the Six Tudor Queen series and Elizabeth of York, which were slightly slower paced and gave a lot more time for these main characters to ruminate on what's going on around them, to mentally process what's happening. For me, if I was going to be really pleased with this book, it probably needed to be about 200 pages longer, just to have those little moments for Henry to process what is happening. And I think it's either a case of Alison Weir, like with Elizabeth, having way too much material, way too many sources to have to deal with, and so much plot because, you know, we know what Henry was doing at certain times in a way that we probably don't for Elizabeth of York. And for each of the wives, even though they are famous, there is a lot less to go through. And so Alison Weir has a bit more time to kind of construct a personality for them, rather than having to work with the restrictions of what we know about Henry VIII. Either that is what's going on, there's just way too much to work with, or it's Alison Weir making a deliberate choice when it comes to how she's portraying these monarchs, Elizabeth and Henry. Maybe they, in Alison Weir's mind, are just not prone to mulling things over. Maybe they don't think about things as much as these other characters, but I don't think that that is actually true. I don't think it would be fair to say that Henry VIII or Elizabeth I are not contemplative characters, considering how both of them go back and forth on decisions, on committing themselves to any cause, to playing off different factions of their courts against each other. Of course they're having to process it a lot, but that didn't feel like it was properly reflected in here. And I think for both books, had Alison Weir allotted herself a little bit more of a page count, then you would get a bit of a deeper sense of their personalities in the way that you did for example, Elizabeth of York or Jane Seymour. But I guess it's a good thing if ultimately I'm wanting more of a book rather than less of it. A last thing that I wanted to touch upon before I finish with this is that I remember when this book was first coming out, there was a lot of discussion as to whether or not this book is necessary. I think the marketing for this book didn't really do it any favours, because this book was pushed very much with the tagline of, you've heard the wives' stories, now it's time to hear his. Now it's time to hear Henry VIII's voice. And I understand what the marketing is getting at, because Alison Weir has not written a novel from the perspective of Henry VIII. But the way that I saw a lot of people on Twitter taking it was that Henry VIII has been silenced and now he's getting a chance to speak, which obviously is not true. There are lots of different portrayals of Henry VIII. We have heard his story played many times. But I do feel like it was kind of bad faith reactions of people being like, we don't need this. Henry VIII doesn't need to have his voice heard. There was this kind of like sixification, this kind of like, go away Henry, we don't need to hear from you. And I do feel like that was kind of a bad faith interpretation of what the marketing was trying to get at, which is that it's the first time that Alison Weir has spoken from Henry's perspective. She has looked at Henry from the perspective of his mother, from all of his wives. Now, after having spent so much time looking at Henry from the outside, she is looking at the man from his own perspective. That's what the marketing was getting at. I don't understand, unless you are making bad faith interpretations, that you could see it any other way. And actually, yeah, I do think a book like this is necessary, because I don't feel like we really do have a true sense of Henry VIII. Yes, a lot is written about him. Yes, a lot of stuff just generally about the Tudors is written or filmed or spoken about. But the fact that we're still having these conversations, to me, betrays the fact that we don't actually have a set idea of him, and we're probably never going to, because this is a person who is a mass of contradictions. So I'm glad that this exists. And this has also made me really keen to pick up Margaret George's novel from the perspective of Henry VIII, which I believe is called The Autobiography of Henry VIII, because I'm really keen now to see how she depicts Henry's internal world. Also, that book is about 1,000 pages long, so maybe it's going to give me something that this book didn't quite manage to do. That all being said, I had a pretty good time with this. I feel like of the Alison Weir novels that I've read, like I say, I probably put it slightly lower down. This to me is comparable to something like The Marriage Game. I don't think I would rank it quite so low as I did Anna of Clever, because Alison Weir is mostly trying to stick to what we know about Henry. She is editorializing at some points, making decisions where she has to, but it does stick to fact in a way that Anna of Clever did not. But as I say, I didn't care quite so much for how episodic it was, how fast-paced it was. I just wanted something that was a little bit slower, but still worth checking out, particularly if you are an Alison Weir completionist. There we go, those are all of my rough little thoughts about Henry VIII, The Heart and the Crown by Alison Weir. Definitely keen to pick up the next book in this series on Mary I. I don't think I've ever read anything from her perspective before, so this is definitely going to be an interesting one. Another controversial monarch from the Tudor line. Do let me know if you have read this book. Alternatively, if you have any other recommendations of Tudor historical fiction, I would love to hear from you. You know I'm always keen to read those. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.